Okay, folks, it is finally time for that video I've been promising for the last couple of days. The 13th in a series on Isom number one. Yeah, I got alerted to a little bit of critique that I had actually missed in all of my 12 prior videos, and it was a good enough critique that I decided I should do a video on it. So this comes from that pages long screed that Eric July featured on his channel in a live stream yesterday. And oh my God, that thing is just, it's nauseatingly bad. It really is. It's not a good commentary at all, with a couple of exceptions. I would say that this screed was like 98, 99% trash, but it had a couple of good points that I saw in there, and those points occurred largely right at the beginning. Like, for example, where we find that in the first scene with Avery, where he's at the ranch, he's just gotten off the phone with Althea, and now we meet Isom, and the internal monologue starts. Probably should have started at the beginning of the book to set the scenes. If you're going to use it, use it. I kind of agree with that, and the reason being is that, when you pay $35 for a comic book and you open it to the first page, you don't want the first page to be blank. You want the first page to actually be giving you information of value, and that is almost completely absent on this page. So, with the exception of knowing that we're outside a police precinct and that this is Florist Park, we're not really given a whole hell of a lot of information on this page, and this is a page that could have been greatly utilized with some of Avery's internal monologue to kind of set the scene for what kind of city or town Florist Park is. But we're really just given nothing here. So I kind of agree with that, but at the same time, it's a stylistic thing. There's no reason that the book couldn't open with, just this page absent of dialogue, absent of any explanation. There's nothing wrong with it, and that's why I colored this in blue rather than red, because I'm indicating this is really a stylistic difference. This is a matter of a more personal opinion than it is any kind of indication of a mistake. So stylistically, I agree with this comment. Now, there are a couple of comments that I want to address that have to do with the matter of time, but before I get to that, I feel like I need to go to the book itself and from the book kind of construct a timeline of events. Now, spoilers for Isom number one if you have not read the book so far, so you're going to be told some things that happened in the book, and there's some significant things. So if you haven't already gotten your copy and read it, now's the time before you go into this. So not even going to do a spoiler countdown. Let's just get to it. So I'm going to give you a sequence of scenes in Isom number one up to a point, because I don't need to cover every single scene in the book to get my points across. But we have kind of a three-act structure. We have, in the first act, is mostly setup, and that's where you have the Florist Park PD and you have police conversations. Then you have Silman Ranch, and Avery gets the call from Althea saying that her friend Jasmine's in trouble, and you need to go talk to Darren, see if he can give you any information on her whereabouts. Act 2, we have Florist Park and a battle between Yaira and Alpha Core. And then from there, we move to Club Merc, where Avery gets into a fight with Santuan, and he's thrown out. When he gets thrown out, he's tossed up into the air, where he collides with Yaira, and then she takes him and tosses him into a car, and that injures him well enough to, or at least knocks him out to the point where he's taken to a hospital. Act 3 occurs after Avery comes out of the hospital, and he is near Club Merc, considering his options. He's gotten his truck and his clothes back, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to go about returning to Club Merc. And then inside Club Merc, we have these two characters, Michael and Lillian, or Liliana. I'm not exactly sure, because their names aren't actually in the book. You have to get the Documon cards to know who these characters are, which is just kind of ridiculous. God. So these two characters are talking inside the club, outside, and then inside the club as Avery fights his way in. He comes inside, and then he and Santuan fight, and then he wins. And so basically that's Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And it's interesting to note that most of this, if not all of this, takes place in the course of a single day. And we know this because we know at least Avery getting the call and then Act 2 and Act 3, they all take place on the same day because Avery actually says, Darren can't expect me to come right back to the club on the same night. So Avery gets attacked in the club, he's thrown out of the club, and that same night he comes back. So when you're looking at this sequence of scenes, this can all really take place on one day, so long as there's no other time cues involved. So if we look at this, we can look at this kind of as a linear sequence of events, but we really can't look at it as entirely linear because there are some things that happen here where there are concurrent events. For example, in Act 2, the battle between Yaira and Alpha Core and Avery fighting with Santuan and getting thrown out of the club, those are actually events that are taking place at the same time. And we don't realize that until Avery collides with Yaira and they hit each other in midair, and then we realize, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. I thought these events were happening sequentially. It turns out they're happening at the same time. So we've got two concurrent events going on in Act 2 that, you start off thinking you're looking at two events in sequence, and then by the point at which they collide, you realize that these things were happening at the same time. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's another reason I don't have this highlighted in red. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's a stylistic choice, and I think it works well. In Act 3, the same thing happens. We have Michael and Liliana conversing inside the club, but that's actually taking place at the same time that Avery is outside the club fighting his way into the club. Now, we don't know that until like 8 or 10 pages after the Michael and Liliana scene, because what we have here is we have the two scenes with, first you have the scene with Michael and Liliana, and there is this radio message from one of the bouncers saying, "We have an issue out back." Now, that dialogue, "We have an issue out back," is actually revealed to us 8 to 10 pages later in the book. We're finding out that that's actually recording the incident between Avery and this bouncer. You have this same piece of dialogue here between the two. So again, these are two concurrent events which we later find out are tied together in that way. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a stylistic choice, and there's no problem with doing it that way. I'm just pointing out that when you look at this timeline of scenes in Isom number 1, we're already not dealing with 100% linear time. We do have points at which the reader has to readjust his or her internal timeline or recognition of what the timeline is. And that's perfectly okay. Now, at the beginning of that pages-long screed, there are a couple of moments where there are some good comments about the use of time at the very, very beginning of Isom number 1. First off, we're told 2 weeks ago, don't start back in time. Generally speaking, that's actually a good idea for a book. If you're going to have a book that your reader is going to largely be immersed in, you want your reader to be immersed in it, you really want your reader to be in the now. Now, this 2 weeks ago comes from the fact that in Act 1, I've grayed out Act 2 and 3 because we won't really be talking about those anymore. In Act 1, we're given the cue on the very first page that what we're seeing, this whole police department conversation exchange, all of this is taking place 2 weeks ago. That's explicitly stated for us. Now, do we really want this to be set in the past, though? For emotional immediacy, you don't. You don't want past events presented before the reader. You really want present moment events, if you can do it that way. But we have no way of knowing at this point, 2 weeks ago from the now, what is the significance of the now? And moreover, since Isom #1 is part 1 of a 3-book arc, we don't know if this whole arc is going to be taking place over the course of 2 weeks. I mean, we know that what happens in this book, with the exception of possible exception of this police conversation thing, takes place in the course of a day. But because we have this 2 weeks ago, now we have to ask ourselves, is the entire book going to be 2 weeks ago? Or is this split in time between the first scene being 2 weeks ago and the rest of the book being in the present day? Now, if the book is set entirely 2 weeks ago, that's still not bad, such that the book takes place on a single day that occurs 2 weeks ago, because, like I said, by the end of book 3, you might actually be 2 weeks along, and now the end of book 3 is the now that we are supposed to feel most especially immersed in as the climax to the ill-advised arc, and it can work that way. So I don't fault Eric for doing this 2 weeks ago, no matter how things shape out from there. This 2 weeks ago is fine as a convention, so long as this eventually resolves. But does it resolve, and when does it resolve? Well, that is the point raised by the next comment, which is, are we earlier today in the present time or 2 weeks ago? And this is a reference to the designation earlier that is tacked on to the Silman Ranch scene. So we start off in Florspark, looking at the Florspark Police Department, and this is something 2 weeks ago. Then we're told that the next scene occurs earlier. Earlier than what? You just dropped us into a 2 weeks ago thing, and now we have to figure out, do you mean earlier than the present point at which we are now? Or do you mean earlier than the present point of 2 weeks in the future from this Florspark thing? And that's confusing. We don't actually know which of these two it's supposed to be. So I find this to be a valid point of criticism. From a reader's point of view, if you say, I'm starting the story 2 weeks ago, and then I'm moving you to earlier, you have to specify. Do you mean earlier as in earlier than that present point at which you already established us? Because you already established we're 2 weeks ago. Now this happens earlier. Okay, so I have to go even farther back in time now. Now, is that actually the case? Well, according to Eric, no. He actually meant earlier today. So earlier today is what he meant by saying earlier. But is that what the book implies? I would argue no. The book is actually telling us earlier that same day 2 weeks ago. And I have a reason for that. And the reason is that at the end of the 2 weeks ago scene, we are given this moment in which the captain, I guess he's a police captain because we're not actually told that, he's a police captain, and the officer who is his subordinate comes to him and shows him a phone picture or a phone video of something. We don't know if it's a photo or a video, and we don't know what it's of. But then, when later in the book, when we learn that it's actually Yaira, we get this photo, we get this page, and this page, Yaira says, "You didn't think I noticed you following me?" And the police are now gathering around her, apparently these were plainclothes police officers of some sort. And what were they doing as they were following her? Well, the most logical thing to assume that they were following her, taking pictures and video and sending it to the police captain. Now, why would we think that there was a 2-week gap between this end of the 2 weeks ago scene and this, which is taking place, to our knowledge, earlier? It doesn't make sense. This is something that Ugh. See what the timeline winds up looking like is that you're given 2 weeks ago in the police department. The police officer is looking at the scene of Yaira taking out the cops, or not taking out the cops, but at least being followed by these cops that she will take out later in that day. And then, earlier than that, Althea calls Avery. Avery goes to Darren's club. Darren and he are talking, possibly at the same time that the scene on the left is happening at the police precinct, so that we get the transition into Yaira's attacking the police officers, both plainclothes and then in uniform, and then Avery gets tossed into her, and so all of this, can take place on the same day. There doesn't have to be this 2 week gap between this first scene and the second scene, and there's nothing in the book that implies otherwise. However, Eric has spoken, and because he's the author, he's automatically right. I'm just saying that the book doesn't necessarily say that, but he is. Now that we have this extra bit of information from him, we now know that the 2 weeks ago scene was really 2 weeks ago, and everything else in the book, starting with the word earlier, happened today, happened in the now. Okay, so that clears up the confusion, but you know what would have cleared up the confusion a lot better? Just change earlier to earlier today. That's all. That's all the book needed. That's it. That's everything. That's the whole fix. If he had put earlier today rather than just earlier, there would have been no question that we had bumped from 2 weeks ago into present time. But because he only put earlier, it left that ambiguity in there, and the events of the book actually supported that ambiguity to the point where we could read the book either way. And that really is why I didn't complain about it. I mean, I saw this. I saw that there was like earlier. Does it mean earlier than 2 weeks ago, or does it mean earlier today now that 2 weeks have passed? I knew that it happened, but because the book had worked either way, I didn't feel the need to bring it up. Now that Eric has actually addressed this point and said, yes, he meant earlier today, then he should have said earlier today. And this is something now, it's funny because one of the things that Eric has told me on a couple of occasions is that I've reported to him things that only I have seen. But in this case, that's not true. You've got this other guy who wrote this several page thing, and granted, most of that was crap. But he and I both noticed this one problem and said, you've got some ambiguity in here. And that ambiguity really should have been addressed by the addition of the word, earlier today. Then nobody would be confused. And so this is a good case of, well, yeah, this guy is the only one who reported it, but I saw it, and I just didn't talk about it because I wasn't sure whether or not it was a problem. Now that I know it is a problem, I've made this video and, take it or leave it. But you can see from that when one person tells you something, that doesn't mean that's the only person who saw that. It's just that that's the only person who spoke up. There are probably other people who have seen things and thought, why don't I know this? Why is this in this order? I don't understand this scene. I don't understand, that why this is colored that way, etc., etc., etc. I don't want to go into all the things that I've already gone over. Please go back and look at my 12 other videos on Isom #1 if you want the rundown on everything that I felt could have been improved in the book. But do realize that just because you're only getting the message from one person, that doesn't mean that that one person is the only person who saw it. It just means that that one person is the one person who was willing to speak up. Because not everybody's willing to put himself out there on YouTube and in the chat and get monetized and be on a Skype call and get lashed. So yeah, there's more out there that you can see. So when you get these criticisms, if you find a bit of genuine criticism, and again, Eric's threshold for what constitutes genuine criticism often depends on who's delivering it. but take it into account, because it may not be the thing that only one person has seen. That one person may actually represent a much more significant contingent of your audience than you even know. But that audience would just, prefer to remain silent because either they like the book overall and don't want to complain, or, they just don't feel comfortable complaining in a public forum. So, that is basically what I have to say about that. And, the frustrating thing is that I know from, just what Eric said in the live stream that he does not think it worth the time to put in to find little things like this. But just imagine if you did. Because then all of these people who, are trying to plumb the depths of, mistakes and errors and stuff in Isom actually wouldn't have anything legitimate to say. Wouldn't it have been great to be able to look at this guy's pages long screed and say, you know what? That guy wrote pages and pages and pages of stuff, and there was absolutely nothing of value in there. But you know what? There actually was this one thing of value in there. Now, whether Eric considers it to be of value or not, well, that's another story. And whether he considers it to be worth addressing or not, expending the energy it takes to find and weed out bugs like this, well, that's another story too. But yeah, anybody out there who's watching this video and looking at writing comics yourself, you've got to put yourself in the mind of the reader. You've got to put yourself in the mind of the person who comes to the story knowing absolutely nothing. And it is your job as the writer to make sure that what it is you want the reader to know, you communicate effectively and clearly. Because one of the things that, people start saying in response to things like this is, oh, you just want to be spoon-fed everything. No, Eric actually wants us to know that it was 2 weeks ago and now it's today. And he thought he communicated that clearly, and he didn't. And this is the way that he could have, by adding just a simple word. Wouldn't you rather have a comic that didn't have that ambiguity in it than a comic that does? That's all I'm saying. And if you can learn from little things like this, well then, of course, you're already going to have slain the much bigger dragons in your book, most likely. So that is my commentary on Isom and Time's Arrow. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. Please hit like if you did. And also do subscribe to the channel so that I can get some more followers on there. Follow me on Gab. I'm not on Twitter anymore. I'm looking at getting onto Truth Social. Haven't gotten there quite yet. And I'm on YouTube, BitChute, and Rumble. So whichever of those preferred platforms is yours, feel free to subscribe to me on that. I'm Mike Partika. Thanks again for watching this 13th video on Isom #1. And hopefully this will be the last of it because, at some point you got to get on Isom #2. So thanks again for watching, and I will talk to y'all later.